tango ekomaka ngai nakomi moto mpona bango. Nakomi tuna mondele akende lipanda totuaka koya nani ye Afrika e.
Gladly so, because I wouldn't have been able to join this conversation. So I'm pleased for once in a while that I'm delayed and I'm able to listen to what promised to be a very good discussion on the challenge of opposition policy in Zimbabwe. I want to begin by thanking Brian, the Topless, for putting this together, including penning the concept note, and for needless to add that this was provoked largely by Justice's interventions of the last few weeks, which interventions are already news across the country. And so we have here a panel of perhaps among the best of Zimbabwean talent. And I'll leave the moderator who has agreed to come in today, Chennai, a regular on this program, to do the rest. Chennai.
Thank you, Ivo. I thought I was going to be out of a job then.
No.
So thank you. Yes, so welcome to today, everyone, which is a continuation of the SAPES Trust Policy Dialogue on the Election Series. Today, we have an esteemed panel, as Ivo has just mentioned. We'll be talking about the challenges of opposition politics in Zimbabwe. Our keynote speaker will be talking about the challenges of opposition politics in Zimbabwe. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Justice Alfred Mavedzenge, who I'm sure is no stranger to most of us. He's a constitutional lawyer and a human rights scholar with international experience of supporting democratic transitions in various jurisdictions. In Zimbabwe, he has been famous for being critical of both the ZANU-PF autocratic regime as well as the opposition. So we've brought him out from outside his pen and paper to come and present to us today. In our discussion panel, we have Dr. Chipo Dendere, who again is not a stranger to this platform, an assistant professor of political science in the Africana Studies Department at Wellesley College. Dr. Dendere received her doctorate in political science from Georgia State University in Atlanta. She studies democratization, elections, and voting behavior in Africa, as well as the impact of social media on politics. She regularly provides comments on African politics to various news desks for CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and also writes for public audience in various platforms. Dr. Dendere is also originally from Zimbabwe. We have Dr. Twende Pishone, a political economist and lecturer at the TM School at UNISA. He has published extensively in the area of agrarian studies and economic development. He's also the director of the Institute of Policy and Strategy in Africa. We also have Professor Brian Raftopoulos, who is a director of research and advocacy at Ukuthula Trust and adjunct professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. He has published extensively on Zimbabwean history and politics. So I'll just give just a very brief overview of context in terms of the landscape for opposition politics in Zimbabwe, as we know, which has been faced with a very, I would say, trepidatious environment featuring the use of the judiciary to remove the main opposition president, Nelson Chamisa, from his position as president of the MDC alliance, led by the former leader, late Morgan Tsvangirai, using the Supreme Court judgment SC 56, delivered in March 2020, that sets out the essence and objectives of the corrective measures, etc., which really was, even that was unprecedented for opposition politics in Zimbabwe to that time. We have seen the setting up of a more pliable leadership of the MDC using the Douglas Monzora arm, claiming to then become the legal president of the MDC alliance. And thereafter, the taking over of the headquarters, as well as the state funds allocated to the MDC alliance on parliamentary position, were also then passed on to Monzora. We then saw the removal of 28 MPs and 105 local councils from the MDC alliance, the creation of a political actors dialogue, the POLAD, which we know was controlled by the ruling party ZANU-PF, and subsequently excluded the main opposition by excluding advocate Nelson Chamisa and his party. We've seen the violence against the opposition party led by Nelson Chamisa in 2021 and in 2022, as the MDC alliance at the time attempted to campaign ahead of the 2023 elections in the Manicaland, Masvingo, and Mashonaland provinces. So we have seen, as I say, most will describe this environment as certainly agitating, as certainly unfair, as certainly not presenting what we would want to see in a democratic country. Again, the introduction of the Private Voluntary Organization Amendment Bill, the PVO bill, with the controversial amendments to the PVO Act, threatening the right to freedom of association by controlling civil society organizations, governance, and program activities. These included the management choices and funding decisions of the civic society organization. Also, to mention the Patriotic Bill, Parliament adopted a motion to enact the Patriotic Bill, which criminalizes Zimbabwean nationals from speaking to foreign groups within and outside government structures. Although framed as a call to criminalize individuals and institutions that call for sanctions, the bill seeks to restrict Zimbabweans within and outside the country from speaking negatively about their country. The increased use of the Maintenance of Peace and Security Act as Zimbabwe's weapon of choice to prosecute citizens as such. So we have seen all these characteristics that exist today that perhaps some would say continue to weaken the position of opposition in Zimbabwe, of the main opposition in Zimbabwe. And so it is in this context that I will invite our keynote speaker to address us on the issue of opposition politics. So over to you, Justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chennai. And thank you very much, Professor Raft and Dr. Ibo Mantaza for creating a platform for us to have this conversation. I think it's a very necessary conversation that we must have. I think, Chennai, you were right when you said you took me away from the pen. I do not consider myself to be a speaker. I consider myself to be a writer. So I often want to communicate my views through writing. But today, let's see how best we will do. I'm going to share my perspectives on the challenges of opposition politics in Zimbabwe based on the various pieces of research which I've been doing on aspects of multi-party democracy, my experiences of interacting with opposition politicians and activists in Zimbabwe, and my experiences of interactions with opposition movements in Africa, some of whom are now governing parties. And I do believe that most of the things that I'm going to say are things that I've already expressed in the different opinion pieces that I've written. Most of the things that I am going to say, I don't believe they are new. I believe they are issues that many of us on this platform have been aware of, but I think maybe what is new is that Ibo and Brian are creating a platform for us to openly have a discussion on this. And I think that's very important. So I've been given 25 to 30 minutes to speak. I might take much less than that. So the structure of my presentation is basically going to be in two parts. The first part is I'm going to speak about the types of challenges which are faced or experienced by the opposition in Zimbabwe. And then I will offer some remarks on what I think are the origins of some of these challenges. Today, I deliberately avoid talking about solutions unless if of course I am asked. It's because I would like to spend most of the time concentrating on the subject of the discussion, which is the challenges. And I also believe that some of the solutions could be subject of some kind of a strategy development of some sort, or something like that. Let me start by offering a perspective on what I think is opposition. In other words, what is opposition in Zimbabwe? What do we mean when we say opposition in the Zimbabwean context? I think we currently have about 130 political parties. And of course, maybe for the benefit of our colleagues who are not very familiar with the legal framework in Zimbabwe, there is no framework for registration of political parties. So there is no database that you can say exists of registered political parties. But there are different sources of information where you can glean information on the existence of political parties. And I think we've got about 130 groups that call themselves political parties that are in opposition to the ruling ZANU-PF. 55 of these participated in the 2018 general elections at presidential, member of parliament, and local government level. However, 23 fielded candidates in the presidential elections. So that's the terrain we are talking about when we are talking about the opposition. Now, what kind of challenges does the opposition face in Zimbabwe? There are different types of challenges depending on the source of those challenges. So there are challenges which are external, in the sense that, number one, these are challenges emanating from geopolitics and other global events. Just as an example, I could give the war in Ukraine has, in a way, shifted the attention of global players from other issues or other hotspots in Africa and in other regions, and the attention has been diverted to Ukraine. Budget priorities have also been adjusted to respond to the crisis in Ukraine. There's also the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the ramifications which on the economies of different global actors. And those ramifications have necessitated some adjustments in terms of budgeting and so forth. So these are the types of global events in geopolitics which also create some kind of challenges for the opposition in countries such as Zimbabwe. But I know you are not interested in that today, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I just have 30 minutes. In terms of external challenges, there are challenges and problems created by the autocratic ZANU-PF regime. And most of these challenges and problems, they are orchestrated to stifle legitimate political competition. And I think it is important to identify some of them. Some of these challenges, in my views, are number one, the capture and weaponization of institutions of the state, including certain levels of the judiciary, the state security institutions, to persecute the opposition and those that hold dissenting political views. I think a lot has been written on this, including by myself. There is selective application of the law in ways that are targeted at stifling political dissent and restricting the opposition from mobilizing for support. There is state-sponsored violence targeted at the opposition activists and its leaders. There is infiltration and attempts to capture and control the opposition. Chennai has done a very good job in her introductory remarks because she exemplified one of the most recent unprecedented attempts to capture opposition, which basically led to the decimation of the MDC alliance and forced Nelson Chamisa and his group to rebrand and introduce the Triple C. The other external challenge is introduction of legislative measures that are targeted at closing the democratic and civic space. I think the key examples here again are the private voluntary organization bill that is currently going through the legislative process. And I think it's in Parliament, which is meant to restrain and introduce all kinds of restrictions on civil society. I think the biggest mischief which this bill is trying to, I say mischief in quotes, which this bill is trying to address is basically to silence those who would want to hold government accountable, and that would affect the opposition as well. We have the patriotic bill, or rather an intention to introduce the patriotic bill. I think Chennai has spoken about that. But I would add on that list the laws that exist in Zimbabwe, which criminalize the uttering of certain expressions which are considered to be insulting of the president. So if you criticize the president in certain ways, then you may be charged of insulting the president, and you will be criminally liable. Those laws, they are simply meant to stifle freedom of expression, and in a big way, they affect the opposition. There is abuse of public resources to give ZANU-PF an unfair advantage, especially during elections. We've seen how resources are marshaled to state resources are marshaled to campaign for ZANU-PF during elections. We've seen this in the past. The reason why I'm running through these issues is because we have had extensive discussions on these problems, including on this SAPES platform. We've had extensive discussions of these challenges. And there's a big number, a significant number of citizens who believe that the opposition would be the solution to some of these challenges. In other words, the opposition would be the bridge to address these challenges and usher in a democratic era. which essentially means the resolution of all these problems that I'm talking about. For instance, creating a government that does not pursue laws that shrink or close off civic space, electing a government that holds perpetrators of political violence accountable, a government that refrains from abusing public resources and so forth. These are the challenges that are external to the opposition. These are the challenges that no one can deny are orchestrated by the autocratic ZANU-PF regime in its bid to stifle political dissent. But I would like to spend more time today talking about the other types of challenges, which I think maybe my colleagues will agree with me, have not been openly discussed for many reasons. Some of the reasons I'll touch on them today. Some of the reasons I've touched on them in my writings, which Ibo said triggered this discussion that we're having today. These are challenges which the opposition creates for itself, or challenges which are internal to the opposition in one way or the other. Remember, I said we have about 130 opposition political parties. Therefore, we should not assume that when we are talking about challenges confronting the opposition parties, we are talking about one political party. Talking about over 130 political parties, or roughly about 130 political parties. Each opposition party seems to have its own set of challenges. But one common challenge is selfishness, which has led or created disunity. Many of these leaders of these political parties are self-centered in a way. And therefore, a cocktail of political groups and factions have emerged as opposition parties. And some of them are, I think one would be forgiven to describe them as fringe political parties. And some of them just, they wake up to life just before elections or something like that. And then after elections, they fizzle out. So maybe that's why also they are described as fringe political parties, or fringe opposition parties. However, in that context, the Citizen Coalition for Change, CCC, commands the largest following and has emerged as the main opposition party after the by-elections of 26 March this year. CCC is expected to be the main contender against ZANU-PF in the upcoming 2023 general elections. I therefore would like to speak more directly about what I perceive to be the challenges faced by CCC for those reasons that I've just outlined. But what do I mean by CCC? Because I think it's very dangerous to just take it for granted that CCC is the coalition of citizens across the country who are disgruntled with ZANU-PF or something like that. In this instance, I mean, in my critique today and in my critique in the past, I've been very clear that I am talking about Nelson Chamisa and a small circle of his friends. I say this because the party does not have any leadership structure except the structure which comprises of him as Nelson, as the president of the party, and a few other technical persons, such as the spokesperson, and I think there's a deputy spokesperson and others. I mean, these are facts. This is not speculation. I think by his own admission, Nelson, I think said the other time when I think the person we thought was the Secretary General of the party said something in the press, and Nelson tweeted and said, "We don't have a Secretary General." Of course, he quickly deleted it, but unfortunately, in this digital era, I mean, the tweet had already been screenshotted and everyone saw it. So I'm not making up a story. There is no structure that we know of. If there is a structure, that structure is secret, and I think no one should be judged for harshly for not knowing it. And at the same time, it would be very unfair for me to criticize or critically engage with people who are not identified as leaders of the party or as as leaders of the party. So I really am talking about Nelson and that small circle of his friends. Now, what are the internal challenges of this group? I think the biggest challenge that this group faces is a serious leadership. It has something to do with serious leadership deficiencies. And I'll try to point out some of them. The first and most dangerous for me is autocratic leadership, which has created an atmosphere of fear and which discourages ideas to flourish. Of course, the evidence of fear is at this point, most of the evidence of fear at this point remains quite, is not largely in public, because when these challenges unfold, it takes time for them to, you see, what the general public will see eventually is a split. But a split is not an overnight thing. Or a split is something that develops over a time. And it goes through stages. It starts with fear. It starts with people not being free to express themselves and their frustrations. And those frustrations boil and bottle up until you get to a point where you start seeing a split. And then many who would have put their faith in that opposition movement start experiencing different kinds of heartbreaks. I think we have seen this with the MDC before, where leaders deny that there are frustrations, leaders deny that things are not well in the cockpit, only for us to be shocked at some point with someone announcing that they are no longer part of the party or something like that. However, there is some evidence in the public, which I think many on this platform could relate with, which shows that because of the style of leadership, an environment has been created in the party where ideas cannot flourish. A few weeks ago, the party published, or rather launched, a document called Pre-Election Pact for Electoral Reforms, Prepare. And I'm going to refer to this document a lot in my presentation for the benefit of our colleagues who are not maybe familiar with the context. This document is supposed to be the official position of the party, or rather of the citizens who are disgruntled with the way ZANU is running the country. It's supposed to be the official position of what the party, CCC, is demanding for electoral reforms. In other words, it is supposed to be the anchor and the basis upon which the party engages with the stakeholders within the regional community, international community, to put pressure on ZANU-PF to undertake reforms. The sad thing about this document is that it leaves out very basic and key demands, which one would have thought that should have been part of the citizens' demand for electoral reforms, because CCC says they are a conveyor belt of citizen demands. I think this is the last piece that I did on this subject. I identified some of these glaring gaps in the document. The document is very silent about the release of political prisoners, including Job Sikala and the Nyatsime comrades, when one would have thought that is an election issue, because those people are in prison as part of the crackdown to silence dissent, to incapacitate the party from mobilizing for vote. But unfortunately, leadership did not see that as something that they should demand as part of electoral reforms. But also the most weird thing is, for me, is that the general members of the party, the citizens themselves, speak about these issues. Their views are very clear about these issues. If you just attend public platforms, or if you just look at social media or anywhere, you will see that the citizens are very clear. Then of course, Nelson and his group would argue that no, we have done consultations. So, but one wonders whether these consultations were done and then with who? With the citizens, and then they didn't demand that the party must ensure that the release of political prisoners is part of an electoral issue. But when we are talking about electoral, I mean, the other thing that the document is silent on is the issue to do with frivolous charges hanging around the heads of different activists. CCC is an organization, is a party that was founded, or that ought to have been founded as a result of collaboration amongst different movements, social movements, including the students' movements and so forth. And if you just look at ZINASU and related student movements, see that there's a lot of activists who are facing all sorts of criminal charges. And these criminal charges are frivolous. They are unable to continue with their lives. They are unable to mobilize for the party because they have to attend to police stations. They have to attend trial. I'm not saying the CCC is responsible for these things, but I'm saying these issues are too glaring for a serious party such as CCC to ignore when developing their electoral demands for reforms. Imagine what it does to a citizen or an activist who has been working for the party and risking in an autocratic environment such as the one that I painted at the beginning, and they are targeted for persecution by the regime. And when their party is crafting a list of electoral reforms, they are silent. They don't say anything. The reality is that it is demoralizing. And remember, I said I'm sharing perspectives that are based on various kinds of research, but including my interactions with some of these activists. These are the issues that they talk about. But unfortunately, because of the autocracy in the party, they are unable to share these things freely. The party decided to be silent on reforms necessary for journalists to operate freely during elections. I encourage you to look at the article that I wrote on this. I go into detail about the glaring gaps. Of course, someone argued and said, no, but the document can be updated. That's true. No one is perfect. And even us, when we write papers, they are never perfect. But I think there's a threshold a minimum threshold where you are supposed to start from in order for you to show that first, you are a serious party, two, you are a party of the people rather than a party of a circle of friends. If you are a party of the people, then whatever you demand as electoral reforms ought to resonate with what the people are saying. So if the people are saying they don't want the PVO bill and you leave that out, and people are saying they want job seeker and Nyatsime comrades out, and you leave that out, and the journalists are saying, no, we don't want to be subjected to reaccreditation during elections, and you don't say that, then you are not the party of the people. And you can't honestly claim that you have consulted with the people. And again, like I said, that some of the evidence is not out in the public. So there is always the agony of being the breaker of news. Because you are then challenged and said, where is your evidence and so forth. But in my interactions with some of the leaders, they do indicate that the first time they saw that document was the day that they attended the press conference. Because the leadership doesn't consult. The second problem is that Nelson, for me, is a leader who has surrounded himself with very few people with experience, institutional memory, and expertise. I think a lot of the people that surround Nelson are very intelligent people, competent, and mostly competent lawyers. But I think a major deficit is that they have no institutional memory of the struggle for change in Zimbabwe. Some of them, I mean, there are many reasons, because some of them were still in ZANU when the struggle started. Some of them have privileges in ZANU or something like that. I think we can debate that another day, but the fact is, and they shouldn't be crucified, by the way, for that, because, you know, even Kuchechi, when we are spreading the gospel, we don't spread the gospel to the converted. We also spread the gospel to the unconverted, so that we can convert them. So my point is not that people who were in ZANU-PF or who benefited from ZANU-PF should not join the opposition. No, my point is those people, the reality is that those people lack institutional memory. And when you put them as leaders of the party and you surround yourself with those people as your advisors, I think you're just creating, you're just depriving yourself of the necessary wisdom that you need. The leadership is also timid. It is unable to lead the party from the front and respond to challenges, including the attacks against the party leaders and activists. And this is not new. This is something that has been there even since Nelson took over the party. I want to show you something here. It's a video. It's a 1-minute video. I want you to listen to the video. The context of the video is that Zimbabwe had just gone through 2018 elections, and the elections had been rigged. And people were now saying to Nelson, what do we do? Right, and this is what Nelson said. Can you hear my video?
Yes, we can hear.
Yes, we could hear it. Now you can share it.
Okay, let me share it. Because I think it's important to go back into history so that we don't just speculate and say and pass on emotions as if they are.
Okay, you can play.
So, yeah, I think you got the gist anyway. What I was trying to show you there is that that was Nelson's response. One of these remarkable leadership response following the outcome of the 2018 election. He makes two critical issues. He said he basically is ambiguous, right, in the way that he wants to respond to this problem. He doesn't offer anything tangible, but he assures the supporters that their vote will be respected. But we all know what happened since 2018 and until now. it's never, basically nothing happened, right? But basically nothing happened. But what we have seen in his type of leadership is that he will never lead from the front. He will say those statements, he will say the poetry and electrify the masses, but he will never lead from the front. More recently, of course, we see the arrests on Job Scala and others. We see the attacks on activists. The man has never been to a demonstration, even to lead from the front and demand that his comrades be released. With Morgan Tsvangirai, for all his sins, I think we saw something refreshing about him. He was prepared to lead from the front. I think you are all aware of what happened in Mfakos 2006 and so forth. Right. The next problem is that there is no clear ideological ground. Why is ideology important in a context such as Zimbabwe? CCC needs to build strategic alliances, both at home and abroad, in order to galvanize enough pressure to force the government of Zimbabwe to undertake electoral governance reforms and to respect the will of the people if ZANU-PF loses in the 2023 elections. And assuming a clear ideological identity would make it easier for the CCC to establish strategic alliances in the region. As it stands, there is very little that is known in the region and internationally about what kind of a party CCC is and why those in the region must consider CCC as an ally. So that answers the question about ideology and why it's important to have a clear ideology. Then lastly, the party there is a lack of demonstrable commitment to democracy. And part of the evidence of this is you just need to see the level of cyberbullying and character assassination of party critics. I think in my second installment, I expressed my shock receiving a message from Nelson saying, accusing me of bidding for someone because I'd been critical of him. And then, of course, you see the cyberbullying that happens. I was talking to a colleague in Ghana quite recently. There's a Ghanaian influencer who came to Zimbabwe and he had a slightly different political view. And many of the CCC followers attacked him online, seriously. I only learned how influential this man is to the political leaders of Ghana when I was there. And I found it very shocking that so CCC wants to galvanize regional support, wants to engage African leaders and change their opinions so that they can support CCC's position and demands for reforms in Zimbabwe. But at the same time, you are bullying the same people who have influence over those leaders. So it doesn't make sense for me. But it starts from lack of commitment to democracy. Because if you are committed to democracy, you don't bully, you don't character assassinate because someone is criticizing you. You engage them. Or at the very minimum, you just ignore them. Another sign that this party is not committed to democracy is that the leadership is averse to criticism and taking responsibility for its mistakes. In order to make my point very clear, I want to show you something here. You see, no one is perfect, like I said. So CCC can also make mistakes, especially when you are when considering that the party is functioning in a hostile environment. Chennai, is this clear?
No, we can't see the writing, so you'll have to just say it.
Okay. Can you see this?
Yeah, that's bigger. But yeah, but we can only see what's on the screen, not the full sentences.
So this is for the benefit of our colleagues who are not familiar with the context. This is a press statement that was issued by CCC And you can find it on Fadzai Mayere's Twitter handle if you want. When the party held a rally in Chinoy on the 11th of September. And two things happened at that rally. One, we are told that there was an attempt to assassinate Nelson Chamisa. But another thing that happened is that a journalist was assaulted by the MDC security personnel, right? It's probably a mistake that can happen. The problem is how the party deals with this kind of mistakes. So CCC issued a statement under the headline, "Another assassination attempt on Advocate Nelson Chamisa." And right at the bottom of that statement here, for those that can see, the party then says, "We have since approached the Rwimbo Muchenje. After the detonation of the explosives, the security team will intensify security to all entry, blah, blah, blah. The security further had to manage the panic crowd which was trying to run to. In the midst of this emergency response effort, a misunderstanding arose between journalist Rwimbo Muchenje and one of our security officers, leading to a regrettable incident of assault." This is not how a serious party that is committed to democracy apologizes for such an incident. The party should have issued a separate press statement in order to ensure that you give both issues the weight that they deserve. You give the issue, the attempts on the life of the leader, the weight and significance that it deserves, and you give the issue regarding the assault of a journalist the weight that it deserves. Now, that press statement created all sorts of ramifications in terms of the relationship between the party and the media fraternity. Now, the other challenge or the other sign that this party is not committed to democratic culture is there is no internal governance structures in CCC. There is no constitution. There is no clarity on how internal party decisions are made. Of course, we have talked about this a lot, and I don't want to dwell on it unless if I'm asked some other time. The excuse that we're given is that, no, the party is trying to protect itself from infiltration. But how is the party going to be immune to infiltration by not having a constitution? A constitution is a standard document which shows how decisions are made in the party, which shows how the leader should be accountable and so forth. You can't be a democratic party that does not have a constitution. But then the excuse that, or the response that you often get from those around Nelson sometimes is that Nelson is pursuing what is called strategic ambiguity. So what we are made to believe is that Nelson is keeping the cards close to his chest, and at some point we are all going to be liberated from ZANU-PF autocracy through some magic that Nelson is going to work out. That way of doing things did not start today. I want to take you back again to this. I want to take you back because part of the challenge that we need to deal with in our society is what I call political amnesia, where we forget certain things. I think you can see this. If you go on Nelson's Twitter feed, you'll find these things. For the benefit of those that may have forgotten about this, you would recall there was a time when we were all engulfed in some debate that was called Signal. We were made to believe that after the 2018 elections were rigged, we were made to believe that Nelson was going to issue a signal and the nation will take action to reclaim the stolen vote. This is what we were made to believe. And then the person who told us that is none other than Nelson. He said, if you can read here, I know the nation needs a signal, but I also have the one and almighty God whom I count on for that signal. The signal is coming. Right? This is Nelson. After that, he says, I think this one is Murakashi, this one, I suspect, who was asking Nelson. And then Nelson says, the signal won't be a Twitter thing. So the signal was supposed to be probably an ambiguous thing. It was going to come through some magical structuralist processes. Then as the debate continued, Nelson finally broke the news to us. And he said, we must all be the change we want to see. There is no need to wait for any other signal. Signals are everywhere, and there is no justification for any further wait. And at this point, we finally realized that Nelson did not have a signal for us. But if you track back to where this conversation started, you will see that he said, I will issue a signal. And we said, when, how? Said, no, don't ask those questions. I will issue a signal. And later on, we realized that there was no signal coming. So this issue of strategic ambiguity did not start today. It started as far back, even as
20 time.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up. I'm wrapping up. Just give me 5 minutes. So there is nothing strategic about this kind of ambiguity if it leads to the kind of confusion as we have seen before. There's nothing strategic. In fact, there's nothing strategic about this kind of ambiguity if it produces policy documents that are poor, such as the list of demands for electoral reforms, which I spoke about. There's nothing strategic about this kind of ambiguity when it does not lead to the party adopting robust ways of responding to attacks against its leaders, such as Job Sikala, Makomborero Aruzivishe, who spent all those months in prison, and many others, to actually take Maduku to help him to get out.
Thank you.
This thing that they call strategic ambiguity is simply a cover and a lame excuse for inaction, which itself is a result of leadership that lacks ideas, that is autocratic, and which is individualistic. Can I make my conclusion?
We will give you another time, because okay, what we need to do is we need to allow, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions for you. So we'll go through the speakers, and then we will come back, and you will get another time to address questions and to give your concluding remarks, if that's okay. Yeah. What I will also do in that time, whilst the speakers are getting ready, I think next we'll have Dr. Dendere. But whilst Dr. Dendere is just getting ready, I will present you these questions so that, again, it gives you time to have a think. And when we come back to you, you might be ready with some questions, if that's okay. So just on, wow, I mean, that was really a packed submission. Just in terms of, you've mentioned some words you've highlighted, self-centeredness and selfishness, which you have said that can manifest in faction. Perhaps you could give us a bit more information in terms of how do we measure this selfish behavior, selfishness, outside of subjectivity? How do we identify and understand what that means? What is the direct disbenefit of having these unknown structures, as you have called them, on the backdrop of the infiltration that you mentioned as being evidence? And then you've talked about poor leadership rallies across the country. Oh yeah, so you've talked about poor leadership, but at the same time, we have other manifestations of that same leadership, such as the successful rallies, the successful engagement on the ground. So how do we balance that notion of saying this is poor leadership, and yet we are also seeing evidence of positive leadership? On the prepared document, thank you for that, because I personally hadn't had any awareness of the things that you highlighted. But I'd like to point out section 5, of the prepare document. As we know, the prepare document is not a document about Makomborero or Jobskala or Joanna or Cecilia or Netai, etc. It is a document about electoral preparedness. And Section 5 is dedicated to political freedoms and media access, some of which on a general perspective perhaps cover some of the points that you're saying. So maybe if you can highlight the deficiency of Section 5, because that does speak to political freedoms and media access. And then on the issue of institutional memory, again, you mentioned earlier about infiltration, and then we know what happened with Douglas Monzora at Yale, being the perhaps those that you might identify as having had institutional memory, but still kind of, we have the issue of infiltration, etc. So in terms of the people that serve as advisors, because you have indicated to us that it is important that institutional memory, where is that balance between institutional memory, trust, and just good outright knowledge, as you've pointed out? So those will be good things, I think, for me, if when we come back to address. And then on cyberbullying, again, I've seen Zimbabweans everywhere talk about cyberbullying, and now I have been victim of cyberbullying. I just reported and people are taken down. But I go back to where people are saying is bullying. What is that balance between cyberbullying, and perhaps maybe even Dr. Dendere can give us some insight of what do we mean by cyberbullying, criticizing? I know you've mentioned just now, you said maybe this is a Murakashi. Again, is that cyberbullying? What do we mean when we say cyberbullying in its entirety? And what does that term really mean? And how should we deal with it? And what does it tell us, as you've indicated, about the political landscape? So we'll pause there and hand over to the next speaker, who is Dr. Chipo Dendere. Welcome. Is Dr. Chipo around?
I am. I'm here. Hi. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome. Welcome to my office. I apologize for my background, which is a little chaotic there. If, when Professor Ibo asked me to come, I thought we were having a conversation on the challenges that the opposition is facing. I didn't quite realize that we're doing a deep dive into everything that is wrong with Nelson Chamisa. Otherwise, I would have prepared different remarks. Having said that, I do think it's important for us to think holistically about the environment in which the opposition is existing in. Among the many wonderful things that my colleague Justice mentioned, Dr. Justice mentioned, I actually want us to go back and think about this idea of a fatigued citizenry. In my day job, I work with young people, with students. And we've been talking about a global rise in disappointment in politics, not just among young Zimbabweans, but among Zimbabweans all over the world. I think they say that 80% of young people are saying that they have no faith in politics. They have no faith in their ability to make change. They feel depressed and disgruntled about the state of politics. In other parts of the world, the young people only make a very small proportion of voters. Sorry, there's some background. I think there's somebody else who has their mic on.
Yes, I'm trying to mute them, but something is going on. So maybe, yeah, just give me a second.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, they're muted now, so you can go.
In most of the world, or at least in developed parts of the world, the young people make up a very small population of, a very small part of the population. In Africa, we know that young people are 65% of our population. In Zimbabwe, the majority of our voters are people under the age of 35. And so I think it's important for us to contextualize where the opposition is campaigning, whom they are campaigning to, and whom are these voters that we expect to participate in politics. So the voters, the citizens, they are fatigued. You know, they are tired in a different way. They are not tired because they've been participating, but they're tired because they feel hopeless about the political system. We are also seeing that the opposition is existing in a world, and I love that Justice started off by talking about Ukraine. We recently hosted Fadzai Mahere at Wellesley and other schools in the US, where she was talking about youth and democracy. And part of what she said is that the world has looked away. The world has looked away, not just from Zimbabwe, but from Africa generally, because there are other crises in the world. There's a crisis in Yemen. There are multiple crises that the world is facing. And for that reason, the opposition, whereas the opposition at the heydays of Morgan Tsvangirai would have, thousands of people watching, listening, helping advocate, helping raise money. This is simply not the case for the opposition today. Something that wasn't mentioned, but I think that is critical, is that the resources, the financial resources available to opposition parties that are not willing to sell their souls to join Pollard are diminished. Politics is money. This is something I write about in my own work. I tweet about it all the time. The election in Kenya, I asked my students to guess today, how much do you think each political party in Kenya spent on the last election? And they said, Professor, $1 million, $2 million. It was 10 million for each political party. 10 million for each political party. In Zimbabwe, the opposition, the largest opposition, should have access to resources from taxpayer-funded dollars, but those dollars were taken by Monzora's party, right? Who is now joined Pollard, which means that CCC, which has become the subject of this conversation, is without those resources. So let me speak directly to some of the things that Justice said, because I like the fact that Professor Mandaza has created the space for us to spar intellectually. The first thing is, well, what is the structure of this political party? And I do find the obsession that we've had as a people, myself included as an academic, is that we want to know, right? We exist in these institutions that are hierarchical. So for us, it's really important to figure out, okay, so there is the president and there is this and there is that. And I've had multiple conversations with people within CCC and outside, and I've also asked them, what is your structure? Because we need to be able to figure out who to talk to about A, B, C, and D. And my issue is always, who's the money person? Who do we go to? And the response, which I think gels with the world that we exist in, where 65% of our voters are young people. They're young people who are not necessarily intrigued by these institutions of hierarchy as they have always existed. So when you have a political party that says, look, we have people that come in and each of our people is serving as some type of leader, right? And for me, it's like frustrating to think about it. Well, they're a leader, but what is their position? And they say, well, everybody right now is a uniform leader, Nelson Chamisa included. And then we're working on building ourselves. We're working on building ourselves in rural areas, and there is evidence for this, right? So this is not something that we need to speak of as a rumor. So where do we get the evidence for rural cell building? We look at the by-elections. I had a debate recently with, a friendly colleague of mine saying, well, Chipo, you put out a tweet that the opposition has done well in by-elections. This is not surprising. And I said, well, I always bring data to the table. So we looked at data from elections from 2000 to 2005, where we found that each time there was a by-election, ZANU-PF was likely to win that by-election. There were only 3 points where the MDC was able to retain its seat. And one of them was Love Mojonge's seat that became Nelson Chamisa's seat. But the opposition has traditionally struggled with by-elections. On one hand, it's because ZANU-PF has more resources, so financial resources, right? So by-elections tend to take up money that's not been budgeted for, and so ZANU-PF would win. But the other thing is that ZANU-PF, the opposition was boycotting by-elections. So I remember back in January speaking to Nelson Chamisa and saying, what are you guys going to do about by-elections? And his response was, well, we don't want to legitimize this thing, so we're not going to participate in by-elections. And guess what? Thousands of citizens went online and said, you'll better participate in by-elections. Alex Magais, I had a really pointed essay that you put out about by-elections. And then the next thing, CC came back and said, well, you know what? we're going to participate. And I remember laughing at the fact that Nelson Chamisa was more disgruntled about participating, but he says to me, well, I don't know how I feel about this, but everybody else thinks we should participate. And I think we need to do what the majority want us to do. So I think if we want to think about specifics, right, I think we look at what are the people asking for and what is the party delivering on. But I do think there is this danger of nitpicking, right, things and pulling examples, even as I've done right now, where we pull these examples and say, well, these should be holistic examples of what's happening with the party. And I think we do better when we look more at the aggregate. So we look at whether or not the party has participated in by-elections and how they have prepared for those by-elections and what have been the outcomes of those by-elections. And I think that speaks better to what the party is trying to do and whether or not the party is achieving that. For me personally, and other academics will agree, we think that local elections are a good litmus test for what's going to happen next. Right? So when a party participates in local elections, I think that's important. I think it's a fair question to ask, well, how are candidates going to be selected for the 210 seats that we have? And the opposition has said, multiple times publicly, it's that, well, we think leaders should be chosen by people in the locales that they're in. And of course, we can debate about whether or not that's the best strategy to use. We think they should be a more top-down selection. We think they should be primaries. How will this work out? But I do think it's important to be open-minded and say, okay, so you guys want to do something differently. You want to do something differently because when I think of Morgan Tsvangirai, I think of Morgan Tsvangirai in 2008. I was a young intern. I still think of myself as a young person, but I was told today that by my students that, 35 is really old or 36 is super old, whatever. I don't know. I still think of myself as a young person. But I was a lot younger when Morgan Tsvangirai came to the United States and he had been beaten up. So we've all seen pictures of Morgan Tsvangirai beaten up. And I was telling my students the story today that he was so badly bitten, his feet were swollen, but he was a strong man. And so he was insisting that he must walk. He must not have a wheelchair, he must walk. And from that incident, I've always asked myself, do we want a politics where our opposition leaders are constantly beat up, they die younger? Some of the research that we've been looking at what necessitated by-elections between 2000 and 2010, what have been some of the challenges with institutional and memory learning for the opposition is that the opposition continues to lose people to violence, right? So when I do interviews with Zimbabweans who've emigrated, many of those people that I've interviewed are political activists that left the country with nothing, without their family, without they left their jobs, they left the little money that they had, and they left the country because their lives were at risk. There have been thousands of people who've either died or left the country because of political violence. So when we advocate for the opposition to do certain things, right, I think we need to think about the context. Do we want to see more people dying? Do we want to see more women ending up in prisons where when a woman is on her period, they're not given sanitary pads? This is the reality of protesting in Zimbabwe. And people will say, well, the people from the past were so strong. They protested, they went to jail. Guess what? They also died. We got ZANU-PF, which has not done anything for anybody. So tell me, how does more people dying, how does more people losing their limbs, how does that benefit us? How does that benefit their children? How does that benefit their families? We talk often about the toxic environment that exists online. We talk about the language that Zimbabweans use with each other. But what we don't talk about is that we're also a nation that has raised 2 million orphans. What do you think is the outcome of a country that has so many children who don't have parents, who don't have homes where they are taught how to engage with people, how to debate. What do we think is the impact of an educational system that has deteriorated, that nobody is teaching proper debate, that nobody is teaching each other proper etiquette of engaging? It's the cesspool that we see online. So some of you are being attacked online now. I want to take you back to 2018, where for 2 weeks, I was attacked constantly. I was told I was going to get raped. My mother was going to get raped. Somebody was going to take off my head and send it to me. You know, this environment where then I went to see my doctor. He says, Chipo, you're not well. You're not well. What's happening with you? What's happening in your mind? It's affecting your physical health. And so that got me thinking that we can talk about the politics, but we really need to think about what these 2 decades under a dictatorship have done to our family structures, have done to the way that we engage with each other, the way that we think about each other. So if we are advocating for more protests, I want us to understand that we're advocating for more children to be without their parents. We're advocating for more people to experience what Justina Mukoko experienced. I urge everyone to read her book, to listen to her speech. You know that when she was disappeared, they had her kneeling on gravel. They had her kneeling on sand. They took off her clothes. They didn't care that this is a woman, that this is somebody who should be covered up. They didn't care about that. They denied her medication. It will take years and years before she's fully recovered. So when we're advocating for certain things, I think we forget that the opposition exists in a brutal system. It exists in a brutal system. Look at everybody who's in the opposition, from David Coulthard, Tendai Biti, Fadzai Mayere, Ostalo Siziba. Do you want images of those people in prison? Look at what's happening with Job Sikala. Right now, everybody is saying people should protest. Job Sikala spoke up and he's been in jail for 120 days. He's been in jail for 120 days, and I believe that he has 6 children that are at home without their father. He is at home. The Nyatsime 17, they are not at home, and their children are without their fathers, without their mothers. So anytime that in a way, I like that the opposition is being thoughtful, right? How do we challenge this regime without continuing to volunteer people to die? Because I don't want to die. I don't want anybody to die. You know, we don't want people in these jails. We really, if you've been to our prisons, you will understand why we don't want to do this. And there has to be a different way of advocating and of agitating for change. I think Chennai gave good responses to the prepared document, so I won't go back and forth on that. I think this was a document on very specific things. They have issued other documents on very specific things, right? So we can talk about the quality of writing, et cetera, but I don't think that that is as important. And then I want to think, but you know, when we think about the cyberbullying, I don't think it's necessarily CCCC only problem. I do think it's a national problem, right? I think it's a problem that is rooted in two almost 3 decades now of living in an authoritarian regime. So anytime we engage in this conversation, we have to ask ourselves, the young people, the 65% of our population who spend most of their time online, who are engaging, what options do they have? So I would like to challenge the opposition more, to say, look, the majority of our, sorry, I'm looking at the questions and they're distracting me. No, Justina Mukoko was not arrested for demonstrations. She was arrested for speaking up against the government. Seriously, you know, one of the things we say as Zimbabweans is that we're the most educated people in the continent, but sometimes I feel like we just don't do enough reading of our own history. We don't do enough reading. We don't do enough critical thinking on our own. So then we end up in these circles, in these debates that are not useful because we're refusing to read and engage critically with things. But I want to come back to the Ghanaian influencer. I think part of what happened with him is that he was saying things without thinking about what he was saying. And people were also responding without thinking about what they were saying. I went back to look at his work from the past. And I think he has evolved a lot. He used to do a lot of skits that were anti-Black women. So I think, if we want to nitpick, we could do this all day, but I do think we could spend our time better thinking holistically. Is the opposition speaking to the youth? Are they giving realistic, achievable goals of how to get people out of poverty? Are they doing this? Are they working towards this? Are we also talking to the middle class and saying, look, you can't have 20 people doing the work for 16 million people. And for me, I think that's the biggest challenge for the opposition, how to bring in more people to do the important work of mobilizing people to register to vote, of having important discussions about democracy in your families, of putting your resources where your wants are. So I think you've got something that I call the death of Democrats. Right? That you've got everybody who has an opinion about politics. We just don't have enough people doing the work of politics. And when you leave a handful of people to do the work of politics, then we can't be mad when that handful of people are making decisions that they think make sense to them. And I want to be clear, I think if more people are not stepping up and actually doing the work, right? So stepping up and saying, I am going to mobilize voters in Ward X, stepping up and saying, these are the challenges that university students are facing, and we are going to step up to help that. You see, this is what Morgan Tsvangirai had going for him, that in the early 2000s, I was young, but I remember there were so many people that were excited and motivated. They didn't need Morgan Tsvangirai to say, Chipo, leave your house, come and participate. It was the citizens showing up and saying, we are here, what can we do? And I think that's the biggest challenge right now, is that more Zimbabweans are not stepping up to say, I am here. These are the things that I can offer to the democracy conversation. This is what I can do to help move the country forward. How can I serve? And I think because we're not asking ourselves that question as Zimbabweans, as the middle class, particularly the middle class, right, that has the resources to do this, the middle class isn't asking itself, how can I serve my country? And so we're waiting for these 10, 15 people to pull all the work, to do all the work for us. And I don't think you can get democracy that way. It simply won't work. We look at the places that many of us live, we live in those Western countries. In those Western countries, it is citizens saying to the politicians, this is what we are doing in our community to work towards democracy. And how can we pull together what you're doing and what we're doing to ensure that the democracy that we have, when an individual dies, like when we lost Morgan Tsvangirai, that doesn't kill the democracy project. So I think we need to do a little bit more of thinking, are the citizens stepping up? Are the citizens doing their job? Because part of being a citizen is making sure that you are engaged in the politics of your nation. Because if we don't do that, right, we're going to have this microscopic lens on the 10 or 15 people that are doing very complicated work. We had the pleasure of hosting Fazai Maheri, and you know that she funds the communications office from her own wages. So we expect people to be writing these elaborate documents. We expect them to be doing all of this elaborate stuff when, well, that stuff costs money. It costs time. So unless more people are willing to volunteer and say, hey, I'm willing to volunteer to be a scribe, I am willing to volunteer to help raise money, then it means that the quality of things that we're going to get is going to be determined by the number of hours that these volunteers have to do this work. So I'm not justifying anybody, but I think for me, it's really a look to say, look, if we're concerned about how the opposition is doing, then we got to be thinking about what the citizenry is doing, whether the citizenry is stepping up or whether the citizen is outsourcing our responsibility to a group of few individuals. And when we outsource our responsibility, well, we get what we get. So I think we really need to go back and say, as academics, are we doing a service, a real service, not just the critique part of it, but are we doing the work of educating young voters? As academics, are we talking to kids in Form 1, Form 2, Form 3, Form 4, explaining to them why it's important for them to vote, explaining to them why it's important for them to participate, so that by the time they turn 18, we know that we've raised good citizens? If you're a medical doctor, are you talking to young people about what the state could be doing in the health sectors? If you are in finance, are you talking to the young people in your lives about the way that global economics work, so that they understand the ways in which politics plays a critical role in every facet of their lives? Because if we're not doing that, and we're expecting opposition leaders, those 5 or 10 people, to do all of that, then we're abdicating our responsibility. And if we're not thinking about practical ways to solve the poverty, to solve the drug crisis, then we're doing not just the opposition a disservice, but we're also doing democracy a huge disservice. Because democracy won't function if the majority of our voters are high on, did you know that like young people are smoking poop diapers? Like they're taking diapers of like 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and burning them and then smoking them. Really, are those the people that you want voting and making decisions about the future of our country? So we all really have to be thinking, particularly the middle class, what can you do to serve your country? And then if we're all playing our part, look, if we're all playing our part and then we're saying to the opposition, this is what we're doing, then we can have conversations with each other and not speaking above each other, right? I don't like everything that Nelson Chamisa does. And I'll put out tweets and then I'll say, can we have a conversation? And sometimes they're free, sometimes they're not. But I also recognize that even the things that I suggest as an academic, they all can't be done because perhaps they're not practical when you're on the ground. And so these two-way streets, so I think we need to come back to really think about how do we serve democracy, not just ourselves, but how do we serve democracy? How do we raise good Democrats? How do we raise good voters in a country that's in a dictatorship, where poverty is very high, where the majority of our voters are very young, and where our opposition is without the financial and the human resources to do the work of democracy? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dendere. Thank you so much. I didn't realize such wisdom at only 35. That's to be admired. So as you have highlighted, that there are issues around how do we go after democracy within the environment that we're operating in. I think you've raised some really important points there. Shall we bring on Dr. Toyende Pishone? Now, I'm just having a look at the time, and then we'll definitely do questions after for you, Dr. Dendere, as well.
Thanks so much, Comrade Chair, for the opportunity. I would also want to thank Ibo and Brian for facilitating this dialogue opportunity so that we can share on these issues. The topic of today itself directs us to focus on the opposition, and therefore we will be forgiven. If there are challenges in ZANU-PF, as they definitely are, it may not be perhaps an opportunity today to talk about them because we are supposed to be talking about challenges in the opposition. And therefore that is our focus. But broadly speaking, and as I take off,
just a small point for our participants. So the title of today is The Challenges of Opposition Politics in Zimbabwe. So I'll just yeah.
Yes,
sorry. You go.
Politics in Zimbabwe. Yes. So basically, it's not about all the parties. It's opposition politics in Zimbabwe. And one issue that I wanted to raise is the issue of the quality of our democracy over time. To say, is it progressing or stagnant or moving backwards? And I raise this issue as we look at the opposition over the years. We know that initially the space was so much closed and it was difficult as ZANU-PF was focused on trying to have a one-party state challenge which Teker and others had to fight. When the opposition, when the MDC came on board in 2000, it then created a binary a situation where you are supposed to be either ZANU-PF or you are in the MDC, which is predominantly now the CC. And therefore, I think, you know, one would be forgiven if when you talk about opposition, of course, there are so many opposition parties in Zimbabwe, as Justice rightfully mentioned or highlighted, including the MDC alliance led by Douglas Monzora. But of course, we know that within the politics of Zimbabwe, many of these political parties end up being very, very insignificant. In fact, they will not command a lot of support. I'm not sure about the recently introduced third force, how it will fare, but we know that the majority of opposition support is commanded by Nelson Chamisa. So the quality of democracy itself should be measured by the level of participation by citizens in decision-making, in policy-making, in processes that decide their fate on a day-to-day basis. And therefore, for me, when we think about a democratic breakthrough, we are looking at the extent to which the politics of the day or of the opposition should be able to usher in democracy, a fully fledged democratic space in Zimbabwe. And therefore, the questions that then come to the fore are whether the current political parties, opposition parties, are capable of bringing about that kind of democracy. I would suspect that just as you know, ZANU-PF President ED came on board through a coup, we can also say at the moment, the manner in which the current president of the CC is occupying that space is probably through undemocratic means, because he was never elected into any of those positions. In any event, we know that he was president of the MDC through an election in Gweru, and that those structures were abandoned through a directive, and no political processes were engaged, including consultation, that resulted in the that party being disbanded and a new one being formed from a political perspective. So there is a challenge there in terms of the quality of our democracy. I think we are going backwards rather than moving forward as a country from a democracy lens. Of course, the issue of participation is some people say, no, this is a citizen party, so citizens are involved. But the quality of involvement is a matter of concern, because you can either be participating through aggregate politics, that is through voting and so forth, or through deliberative politics. I think when you see the address to citizens at a rally, you can't call that democracy, because the citizens are not engaging with the leadership. They are listening. Either they are being given instructions, they are being told what is happening. It's not a platform for engagement, for exchanging of ideas, of decision-making, and so forth and so on. So the quality of our democracy, I think, even if we look at the alternative, it's going backwards. The second issue that I want to raise is the issue that was raised, I think, in 2013 by Dr. Zamchia when he spoke of fear. I think the role of fear in Zimbabwe is so daunting that it is almost capturing us at the same place, if not taking us backwards. Because I think there is fear in almost everyone. There is fear in the military, that they think that if a new party, or if anybody was to come into power, they may be persecuted for their wrongs. They also want to protect their economic gains that they got through various means. There is also fear, even in ZANU-PF of structures, if they were to be removed from power, they will lose access that they have through patronage and other processes and so forth. But I think now we also see a certain kind of fear that is now encroaching into the opposition, where opposition leaders are also afraid of their leader. They can't voice. They are almost like imprisoned, because they are told that you are no longer a Secretary General, and they clap your hand. You are no longer a VP, and that's it. There's no. They can't raise their voice. They have no voice, actually. And it's a sad situation that the fear that we used to know being utilized in ZANU-PF is not being used in opposition. It's a very sad situation. The other angle that we can also look at fear is how it's affecting our voters. I think the voters are also afraid of participating openly in politics, because they know that if you are seen participating, you can also lose some benefits, or you can be attacked and so forth. And I think that until we are able... Sorry? And I think that...
You can go ahead.
You can lose your life.
You will have to. I've just been told about time.
About time?
Yeah, because I think we should be finishing in about 25 minutes. So you will have to come into your concluding remarks.
Okay. Because I realized that the other discussant at 30 minutes, but I understand.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the other issue that I want to also discuss is this issue of ideology, which was raised by Dr. Mabedzeng. I think this issue presents a big challenge, in that where the ideology is not very clear, sometimes it's difficult to define strategy and actions by leaders. And I'll give you a very vivid example. When you say faka pressure, you are presupposing that you want to be very radical in the manner that you engage with the state. But if you are also then superimposing religion and Christianity on that, it's a contradiction in terms, because Christians, by their nature, they don't actually confront issues in that manner. Like he was saying, they wait to hear the voice of God. They don't act. So it's a big challenge. And I think I want to think that this comes about because of lack of clarity in ideology, because people then get confused and they they then triple themselves. On the question of structures, which was also an issue that was raised, and one of the questions that you, Madam Chair, raised was to say, but what is the effect of lack of structures? Without taking this away from Dr. Mawezinga, I think the point that I want to raise here is that without structures, it is very difficult to predict the actions of the leaders or the party that is supposed to govern. You need to be able to predict. So you need to know who is doing what and where, you know? And also the question of accountability, which also touches on what Professor Denire was talking about. Because if there are no structures, it's difficult now to see how resources can be accounted for. You need to be able to have systems, processes that enable you to then advance certain positions. What do I think is the way forward? In my concluding remarks, I think what I think is the way forward is that there is need for a political settlement. If the fears of the different categories of people are not addressed, people will continue to act in ways that are very difficult for us to understand. You know, it is difficult to understand why if somebody loses elections, might want to declare themselves a winner. It's difficult to understand why somebody wouldn't want to go to a congress in their party because they think they might lose. So we need to understand the fears of these leaders, whether at a national level, in their political parties, and address those fears. And I think the way to address these fears is through dialogue. Dialogue at local level, national level, within political parties, at a national level, and so forth. And I think we need to also create consensus. Consensus because if there is no consensus from below, it's difficult to then come to a point where we can agree. My last point is to say that a hegemonic system such as ZANU-PF is very difficult to fight as an individual. I think it's important for people to appreciate that collective efforts are more powerful and rewarding than to act as individuals. Thank you so much, Comrade Chair.
Thank you so much. And I'm really sorry. I think it has been an oversight on my part in terms of time. So without further ado, I think we'll move on to Professor Raftopoulos, please.
Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers and to SAPES for allowing this very important forum. I think because of time, there's so many things to talk about, but I'm just going to restrict myself to a few areas. What we are talking about here today is the legacy of particular forms of rule. The legacies from the colonial period, which have affected the post-colonial politics, but also the legacies of the anti-colonial struggles themselves, which created both narratives of liberation, narratives of democratization, but also authoritarian and militarist forms of opposition, which fed into the kind of authoritarian politics which we have in Zimbabwe today. Part of the challenges that the opposition face, which have been set out very clearly, is that they've pretty much done everything lawfully to try and come to power. They've been to elections, they've had protests, they've had tried to leverage at regional and international level. They've fought elections and they've won elections, but they've been denied the right to take power. This kind of thing brings into the fore the broad challenges that opposition parties face, which are not just the politics of authoritarian rule, but also the regional and international constraints. And within Zimbabwe, those constraints include, as some of the speakers have put, the changing narrative internationally because of Ukraine, the regional solidarity for the ZANU-PF rule over the sanctions question, which has not moved at all. So this also tightens the space internally and tightens the possibilities. The manner in which ordinary citizens are able to participate is also affected by the huge structural changes which have taken place in Zimbabwe. The massive informalization of our economy, which has taken place since the 90s. And this has therefore unraveled formal forms of organization and created much more individualistic forms of dealing with the struggles within Zimbabwe. Also, there's been a decapitation of the independent middle class. Most of the middle class that are there are now linked to state and state patronage. So that middle class is not as effective as it was earlier on. The challenge for the opposition is not only these massive constraints, which nobody can overlook, but the sense that, and in some ways we made the same miscalculation about nationalist politics. Let's first get rid of the authoritarians and then we'll deal with democratization later. A kind of translation of a two-stage theory. And that's always going to be a problem because in dealing with the opposition, you also have to deal with your own, in dealing with the authoritarian regime, you also have to deal with problems of internal democratization in order to be able to confront the future in a better way. And that, therefore, trying to leave it as a next stage is always going to be a problem. Politically, we've seen it in our region, the unraveling of liberation movements, growing authoritarianism, the assumption that once you get rid of settler rule, then we'll deal with other issues. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. So I think we certainly have many challenges ahead. And I'm just glad that this forum can begin to talk to these challenges. And what we're seeing in the opposition at the moment, it's not new. There are problems in the opposition. They go back to the days of the early days of the MDC. Questions of accountability or surrounding the leadership with a kind of a kitchen cabinet, ethnic struggles within. These are not new issues, but they certainly have been exacerbated by the massive challenges that this opposition faces. And it's important for citizens, for intellectuals to raise these questions, not only to see the constraints which are there for everybody and which nobody denies, but we must see the possibilities of raising these questions now so that we do not repeat the politics of the past. We do not repeat the idea of putting off internal democratic questions until you get rid of the authoritarian leader. Because what you will do then is probably reproduce the politics of that authoritarianism. And unfortunately, as the speakers have noted, there's already indications of that. So these different layers, these different levels, they speak to these broad challenges. And they're not going to be easy to deal with, but at least that we begin to talk critically about this, we begin to confront the leaders in the opposition, that with these problems, we're not only critiquing ZANU-PF, which many of us have done for decades, but we're looking internally at the history of our own struggles and internally critiquing what has happened. And I think that's absolutely essential in moving forward. So for time's sake, I'm just going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I have to say, I've certainly been taken to school on this panel. A lot of new nuances in terms of how we can approach the democracy question, given the challenges that the opposition in Zimbabwe does face. So just before I come back to our key speaker, I can see there's some hands here in the chat. I think Dr. Ibo is got his hand up. And
thank you, Janai.
Yeah, go on.
Thank you. I hope I haven't preempted you. You wanted to say something else?
No. You
wait.
also, I just look if there's any more hands. People, you put your hands up in the chat if you want the opportunity to say something.
Well, I just have 3 points to make. The first is a red flag. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, we discovered that there have been only 150,000 new voters. 150,000. So the anticipated or expected youth bulge has not yet materialized, 10 months away from election. So we're lucky to have a repeat of the Zambian or Kenyan, where the youth have made a difference. The second, in that context, is the sad reality that the middle classes about whom reference has been made, in terms of their voting patterns, 2018, tended to go along with ZANU-PF or to abstain altogether. The implication being that we have a problem. The triple C have a problem in trying to mobilize the middle classes who constitute the majority of the voters on the voters' roll. Related to that also is that there's been a lot of debate about the nature and content of the opposition, whether it's a political party or movement. The reality is that our politics, not only in Zimbabwe, but in Africa generally, these so-called parties are mere election platforms, nothing more. And one of the glaring features of the Zimbabwean opposition in particular has been the failure to define and project an alternative. It's not enough just to oppose. And as Brian indicated, the MDC, Triple C have won elections in the past. And given the nature of the technocrat state, they've not been allowed to take. But more worrying is the failure in 2022 to define and project an alternative policy framework. And for me, that is a big worry. But the biggest problem with regard to Zimbabwean polity is this very peculiar situation in which, ever since independence, all opposition movements, parties, individuals are labeled enemies, whether it was Tekere, whether it was ZAPU, the Dubuchena's party, whether it was the MDC itself and Triple C. The tendency of the Zimbabwean state to label and treat the opposition as enemies. You know, I think it's not, as Sean has said, it's less to do with the tendency towards one party state. I think it has to do with the mindset, which is religious technocracy, in which opposition movements are regarded as enemies. It's peculiar. You don't have the same situation in other countries in the region. And I think one has to try and explain that, Brian, and how in trying to assist the opposition movements in Zimbabwe, how one can project that pathology in a manner in which one can begin to confront the Zimbabwean state. I'll stop there, Chinai.
Thank you, Ibo. I'm just trying to see if there are any hands up. No, but I can certainly see some questions in the chat. So I'll see if I can just read out. Okay, so there's a comment here. Applying pressure doesn't have to be violent. There's so many non-violent ways as well. Structures evolve even within organizations. The trend is to shorten decision hierarchies compared to long vertical approaches. This is on the issue of structures. And I think in relation to the term Faka pressure. And then I think people were asking for more time. There's a comment from Nancy Njenge saying, thank you, Dr. Mavezenge and Dr. Chipo. You spoke so well in the context, and the common thing in your presentations is that we are operating under an autocratic regime. I understand Dr. Mavezenge probably because that's the approach he is used to as an activist, minimizing risk, but taking them anyways. Now to Dr. Chipo, could the issue be solved by getting more young people to register or to be aware of the political environment? Because if we say we don't want more people in prison, more women in prison and the likes, are we going to win an election and ZEC will freely declare CCC the winner? I think we should focus more on how we can collectively fight the dictatorship and emerge winners. That's definitely risky unless we are to settle for a power sharing scheme. I disagree. Another point from Avoid, I disagree with the view that people are not stepping up. From experience, people are trying and risking their lives for the opposition beyond the arrest of the top leadership. We have many youths being victimized in communities in their attempt to push back ZANU-PF authoritarianism. And from Makomborero, I believe there are revolutionary obligations that we cannot run away from in as far as our reaction to the closure of the democratic space is concerned. These obligations are critical to the success or lack of it thereof in this, our national democratic revolution. So I think there's some points, some discussion points there. But before I hand back to Dr. Mavezenge, I think coming back to the issue that has been raised of voter apathy, I know you raised the point when we had the video listening to Nelson Chamisa speaking. And in that context, the issue, I think, what was on the line is voter apathy. So to what extent do you encourage voters at the time ahead of elections to go and vote? What perhaps coming back to that day and that setting would have been a more appropriate thing to have said in your perspective, other than go and vote, and we will seek to defend the vote. And of course, we all know what happened on the 1st of August, 2018, which links into Chipo's point of what are we saying when we are saying we want people leading from the front? We want more noise being made about those that are incarcerated as political prisoners. What are we saying? What is that action that we are advocating for? What are its ramifications? And what political mileage does it actually then achieve for us? And I think for me, when we are comparing, there's been a fair bit of comparison between I would like to call him the founding father of democracy, Morgan Tsvangirai in Zimbabwe, versus the current main opposition leadership in Nelson Chamisa. And some have said, what now? But maybe show us that leadership from the front in terms of the political mileage in getting us to the position that we are seeking to achieve. How to address that, cognizant of the challenges that opposition faces in the Zimbabwe context. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Mavezenge, for your concluding remarks.
Thanks, Chennai. I think I'm going to be selfish and restrict to 3 issues. But point of correction, because we should not revise history. Morgan Tsvangirai is not the founding father of democracy in the post-independent Zimbabwe. I would argue that there are people who came before Morgan, and these include Joshua Nkomo, who fought against Mugabe's early tendencies of dictatorship. Then we had Tekere later on fighting and taking Mugabe head on to stop him from the one-party state agenda. So I wanted to correct that. I think one of the issues that looms large here is how to deal with the issue of political prisoners. You see, we don't have to invent the will when the will is working, right? We have had experiences with this issue. And Chipo, thank you for bringing up this issue of Justina Mukoko. I think I'm the same age with you. Probably I'm 2 years older than you or something like that. But I have had the benefit of not reading about this story of Justina. I was there when it happened. I was an activist. There were various search parties that were established, and I participated in some of them. So I want to demonstrate how in the past the issue of political prisoners has been dealt with, as a way of also engaging with you, Chennai, on your question about Section 5 of the prepared document, where you say, where Triple C says they are demanding political freedom, respect for political freedoms, then that is enough to cover the issue of current political prisoners and those who have frivolous charges hanging around their heads. No, you see, in the past, when Justina Mukoko had been finally produced, I think, at a police station, and she had gone through the horrible experiences that Chipo described. She was in prison. One of the things that Morgan Tsvangirai, was to make it very clear to Kgalema Motlanthe, who was the then president of South Africa, that in order for the government of national unity to be implemented, Morgan was not going to take part anymore unless and until Justina is released. So what Morgan did right there is to take advantage of a political moment, in this case, the implementation of the GNU, or GPA as we used to call it back then, to put the issue of Justina Mukoko as a political prisoner in the center. Morgan could have chosen to just say he won't take part until political freedoms are respected. Then there was another case earlier on, I think in February 2009, where you see the period from 2008 to 2009 was a very tough period for activists. I think there were about 30 activists, and including MDC activists and civil society activists, who had been arrested and detained. And Morgan was supposed to be sworn in as prime minister. And he made it a condition that he would not be sworn in unless those political prisoners were freed, right? Unfortunately, he didn't get his way through because some of the political prisoners remained there, and Morgan had to be sworn in. But to his credit, he made it a GNU issue. He took advantage of a political moment to put the issue of prisoners, political prisoners of conscience, to be at the center of the debate. I will take you back again. Earlier on, this many people may not know it, and I encouraged the David to write his memos on this. When the results of 2008 elections were being kept under secret by ZEC, someone is trying to mute me here. Tendai Biti was one of the people who announced the election results, and he did so at Miku's hotel. And by so doing, he was considered to have committed a crime, right? So that caused him and others to flee the country and so forth. We know what happened. But you see, when Thabo Mbeki, who then had been appointed facilitator for the GNU process, was trying to get Morgan and Mugabe to meet and speak. For many reasons, Morgan didn't want to meet with Mugabe. But what he did, because Tendai Biti, on his way back to the country as a negotiator, had been arrested at Harare International Airport, now Robert Mugabe International Airport. And he had been arrested by unknown, and detained and abducted by unknown persons who obviously were linked to the state, but clearly were not police officers. Morgan said he was not going to talk to Mugabe until Tendai Biti had been released. What I'm saying is Morgan took advantage of the political moment to put Biti's issue as a political prisoner at the center. Someone said, what has this to do with what we are talking about? What I'm saying is Nelson Chamisa and his group should make issues to do with the detention of political prisoners to be at the center of the election debate, because it's an election issue. The reason why those people are in prison is because it's part of ZANU-PF's election strategy. So if you don't confront it as an election issue, then number one, you are passing yourself as not serious. But secondly, you are also demoralizing the activists. And that's why I think one of them said, we have obligations. One of the obligations is to make sure that you provide enough solidarity to your activists. Then the second question was, how can we say Nelson is incompetent given the huge rallies and given that his party won the majority of by-election in March 26? I think you need to follow the recent Kenya elections for you to get an answer. If I had time, I would have shown you videos and images of the massive turnouts at Raila Odinga's campaign rallies. But we all know what happened. So rallies are not in this environment, because Kenya is even better than us in terms of the political condition, in this environment, that's not the sign. And even if you go back, I think the elections of 2013, Morgan did a massive rally at Freedom Square, which is the area around Showgrounds. And we all thought he was going to win. In fact, I'm told that some decisions to proceed and participate in that election without the voters' roll were made on the basis of the huge turnout that had taken place at that rally, right? The numbers of people attend rallies for different reasons. And some, as Ibo, I think, has already indicated, he said the statistics on voter registration are very disappointing. So how do we still consider attendance of rallies a success in this environment and in this era? And of course, look, Chipo, you also said it's unprecedented. I think it's not Chipo, it's you, Chennai, you said ZANU-PF and its machineries took an unprecedented action against the opposition and tried to capture the opposition. So the word unprecedented there means that it has never happened before. The elections, the by-elections that happened on March 26, right? They, in my view, in my recollection, this was the first time we had by-elections from opposition strongholds at the same time, being held at the same time. And the opposition was expected to retain its seats. And if you are going to say that is a sign that Nelson is competent enough to win 2023 elections, I think you need to reconsider that view, because these were opposition strongholds. The only difference is that these by-elections were being held at the same time. Then the last question, I think, was, what is the benefit of having unknown structures? I think for me, the question is that question you should direct it to Triple C, because they are the ones who are having unknown structures. For me, what I know are the disadvantages of having unknown structures, or of having no structures at all. I don't know if we can say unknown structures, because we don't know whether they have structures or not. Then finally, I would just say in conclusion, quickly.
You can't conclude, because I can see loads of hands coming up for you on your. So you can.
I'm happy to wait. I'm happy to wait.
You okay? I think Chipo has had her hand up, and then after Chipo, we can have Tafadzwa Kamidza as well.
Hi, actually, Chennai, were there some direct questions for me or no?
There were just some comments in the chat from Nancy on, and then I think somebody else highlighted that there were some young people getting involved in the current register to vote in terms of participation. And then Nancy had raised some things. So if you wanted to have a look at those before you respond, perhaps I can bring in Tafadzwa Kamidza whilst you have a look in the chat.
No, actually, I think I'll answer. I had seen those, but I do think, because Professor Ibo also raised the voter registration issues, which I've raised. So in order for us to talk about the youth bulge and the lack of registration, I think that agitating ZAC should not be left to the opposition. And I'll keep repeating this, right? So we were talking this afternoon with some students from UZ, asking why students are not registering to vote. And initially, I had one of my students from the US say, well, when you guys have activities on campus, why don't you just bring someone to register people to vote on campus? This is what is done world over, right? You have registration centers set up as pop-up registration centers at universities, at DMVs, at any place where people congregate. In Zimbabwe, ZAC completely manages the voter registration efforts. In Harare, we only have 2 places where people can register to vote. So what needs to happen is that everyone needs to organize, and voter registration everywhere in the world is not the responsibility of just political parties. Churches should be involved in encouraging people to register to vote. Youth centers should be involved in encouraging people to register to vote. Universities should be involved in encouraging people to vote. And so everybody needs to be agitating ZAC and asking them, because they did promise, right? So speaking about documents, a document that was produced by ZAC last year was that every citizen in Zimbabwe must be within walking distance to a registration center. So that's something that we as citizens need to demand from ZAC. It is your right to be able to register to vote, and we need to make sure that we are demanding that from ZAC, number one. Number two, every civil society organization, and I know that civil society organizations are working really, really hard. We've been working with about 12 right now. But the other thing, to talk about the challenges that the opposition faces, we had one civil society organization that's been mobilizing people to register to vote. They were approached by CIOs and asked, sorry, my light just went off. They were approached by the CIOs and said, well, in your organization, you have somebody who's professed support for the opposition, and it wasn't even CCC that that person was supporting. So now you can no longer do voter registration work. So you see, so these challenges that seem like external to CCC are actually big issues. The other day, I was tweeting about distressed calls that I received from Epworth. For me, it's like, well, Epworth has been taken by ZANU-PF, so why are they terrorizing people? What they're doing in Epworth and in other peri-urban areas is to demand voter registration evidence from people, demand that people share their IDs with whoever these ruling party goons are. And then they're also busing people. And the busing people, I think, okay, so maybe this could work for everybody, right? So if you get bused, you should just go and register to vote. But people are saying, no, if we get bused, now they have our information. They are pulling down people's homes. They're doing, etc. They're doing all of these violent acts that are happening right now. So I feel that as long as we are not actively thinking about the challenges that opposition is facing, that are not just external to them, but also end up with creating a caged opposition. One of the things that I think is that not everybody can be trusted to be a part of the opposition, simply because people have sold out people, have gotten people ahead, I think it was the case last year where the opposition would be planning something and then all of their information would be out. And it goes back to the fact that we are in an economy where people can be easily bought. So as we're thinking about, okay, so the opposition needs to have all of these clear things, you also have to ask yourself, can most people be trusted to do the work that needs to be done without selling out for 2 cents, without compromising the democracy project for their own good? And then the other thing that I have to respond directly to Justice is saying that the opposition hasn't been speaking publicly about job, and that's not true. As I said before, we hosted Fazai Mahere, and part of what she was doing was speaking to the diaspora, speaking to any diplomats that would be willing to meet with her. And we've also realized that African diplomats, it's much easier to have conversations with them outside the continent than it is inside the continent. And I'm not saying she had conversations with diplomats, but I'm just telling you that it is easier to have conversations with diplomats outside the continent of Africa than it is inside. And one of the things that she did in her talk here on campus was to share a brief, message about Job Sikala and everybody who's been arrested. And for me, it was like, well, this talk is supposed to be about you and your work. But her response to me was that we cannot do our work if we're not talking actively to anybody who will listen about what has happened to Job and what has happened to the people that are arrested. So I think we can question whether or not we think their methods are what Morgan Tsvangirai would have done, their methods are what Tendai Biti would have done 2 decades ago. Or we can also ask ourselves if the methodology that they're using right now is relevant to the context in which they're existing in. So this idea, I think I have to really caution us on the danger of dismissing, sort of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because we're not getting the 1 to 5 things that we like. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chipo. I think we will come to Tafadzwa. I've seen you've lowered your, you're still there. Please you can unmute.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I have 3 issues that I want to share. Yeah, the first one is in terms of Nelson Chamisa and Tsvangirai comparison. I don't think that comparison is actually very relevant to the discussion, right? Nelson Chamisa is still existing and is still in Morgan Tsvangirai has died. It's like you are comparing a retired footballer with a playing footballer. I don't think we are able to get the good and the correct comparison when you compare those issues. Then the second issue is that within Tsvangirai and Nelson Chamisa, the context was so different, right? The context in which Morgan Tsvangirai had and the context in which Nelson Chamisa has is also different. I want to come to Justice where he compared how Tsvangirai handled Jessina Mkoko's case. At least there, Tsvangirai had a bargaining power. It is something that he was able to bargain in order for those people to release. But currently, you cannot compare Nelson Chamisa to bargain on anything because he doesn't have anything. And that has been explained by Dr. Chipodendere, explained it very well, to say we do not need to actually criticize Nelson Chamisa to that extent. And when it comes, the second issue is in terms of election and voter registration. From this discussion, one can pick that people are assuming that when we register so many people, automatically it means that we've won the election. But I need to twin the two, the voting pattern and the voter registration and the actual winning of the election. So it takes two to tango. Yes, we need voter registration, but we also have a mechanism of make sure that that election is protected. That is where I want to come in. And I have seen people on social media criticizing Jonathan Moyo when he pointed the issues of V11 and V23. And if you go back to the Ugandan election, and you go back again to the Zambian election and the recent one, the Kenya election, you would find that the V11 is a common entry point of voter tabulation. It's actually a key point, right? We are now in the 10 months going to the election. And I think the most fundamental debate is about how are we going to make sure as an opposition, we collect those entire V11. The question in 2018 is that there was actually lack of certain percentage of the V11. That makes sure that the citizens actually lost the case. But the question is, we need now to start to discuss in terms of how best we can protect the vote, given the different circumstances that we are in. We know we have the rural community, we have the peri-urban and also the urban area. Within the urban area and the peri-urban, it might not be challenged, but in hardcore areas, how are we going to make sure that we are going to win an election? Because to win an election in Zimbabwe, it's not basically, or for Nelson Chamisa to go into the election, it's not basically to say you won, but it's the actual to reduce the percentage in which ZANU-PF was winning from the previous. Then the last point that I have is of Jobo Uyaskala. The state, if I look in terms of the percentage and how the cases actually developed, the state does not want to try job scam. So it just comes back again to the historical context where Mugabe and Nkomo would go to prison, but without trial papers, right? The state has actually failed to produce that docket in order for the trial to kickstart, right? So you cannot just blame those issues on Nelson Chamisa. It is actually the state that is playing its own role, is playing its own part, and it doesn't need to come and interfere with what the state is producing. But automatically, as soon as that the state didn't want to try those Nyatsime 16 areas. And this is actually a point of advocacy when we are going to meet those whom we think they can stand with the movement. Because here it is actually the state, in as much the law clearly states that the evidence or the trial, you can arrest someone within the reasonable time, being brought into court. On the 8th of October, it expired in that those papers were not brought into. And I would also to advise just in that CCC as a movement, it has actually gained more allies within the region. That's why you see, for example, I would want him to explain on Pando's conversation when he held that breakfast meeting, or is it a conference on a Zimbabwean issue, where Mtambala quickly said it is not because of the sanctions, but it's basically because of the ZANU-PF system, right? It clearly that shows that the issues that CCC are raising are actually being accepted within the region. And it is also being tested by the Zambian leader, who actually confirmed that we now need a SADC to deal away with the dictator. We don't want people to come into the office or occupying office using a barrel of a gun, which shows that the CCC message is actually accepted. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I've just had a request. Justice, in your submission, you mentioned you brought in a comment that was made by somebody who actually did spend a long time in prison. And he's just asked to be given a couple of minutes to say something. So I'll just let Makomborero speak. You can unmute. Is he still on the line?
Yes. I'm still on the line. I think am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. I think it was a very, enriching debate. There were great minds, and also my understanding as an ordinary, foot soldier with regards to all this is we need to. I feel, I'm just giving my honest submissions. I feel that number one, in Zimbabwe, so far, the succession of Robert Gabriel Mugabe is not yet completed in ZANU-PF. And number two, the succession of Morgan Tsvangirai in the opposition is also not yet completed. Why am I saying so? In ZANU-PF, there are various also infightings and contradictions, and also come to the opposition. For me, it feels the same, but I also want to define what I also feel as opposition. I feel that opposition, it's a broader term, which unfortunately, in recent years, due to the issues to do with succession crisis, due to issues to do with also, various transitions, the term opposition has kind of been bastardized to such an extent that the opposition has also only been left to like the political party. But my understanding of the opposition, it has been so wide to include those against corruption, those against unfair labor practices, those against assault on academic freedoms, and those against poor service delivery. What am I speaking to? I'm speaking to residents' associations within communities. I'm speaking to the Zimbabwe National Students Union. I'm speaking to the trade unions, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. I'm speaking to the civil society. They gave a bigger role that they need to play as the wider opposition. Because if we were to check back then, when these other, institutions that I gave mention to were very vibrant, the labor, the students movement, the civil society, the church, etc., when they were vibrant, the political party, the political movement during those days, the MDC, was more of an electioneering platform. I'm not a renowned, academic or a renowned politician or political scientist, but what I can tell you for real is my experience on the ground, like in 2011 when I enrolled as a first-year student and joined SNASO, was that I would know that maybe for 6 months running, the headlines in town, in ZBC, in the Herald, in Daily News, in Newsday, would be ZCTU, fighting with ZANU-PF over salaries. Then from there, the next 6 months, it will be Crisis Coalition in Zimbabwe, fighting with ZANU-PF over civil and political rights, or maybe Residents Association fighting with ZANU-PF. Then the following months, it will be the Zimbabwe National Students Union fighting with ZANU-PF over grants or academic freedoms. The next 6 months, it will be the ZCTU fighting over workers, rights and wages. So the opposition would really be that much relevant towards elections. And my understanding was also that someone like Morgan Tsvangirai would be seen like the Save Zimbabwe campaign. I understand it was led by the civil side, and Morgan Tsvangirai would actually more have be invited, kind of, to participate, but the conveners and the organizers would be the civil side. So I feel that there is a kind of, maybe due to clash of the democratic space, there's been a kind of a shutting out all those critical voices, and also there's also been maybe the unresolved or uncompleted Morgan Tsvangirai succession conundrum. Also, the opposition in regrouping has also not been able to comprehensively include maybe all those voices. And what I'm also seeing is that some of them believe that they need to be involved, but maybe also there's no space, or also maybe I'm sure there are academics here who can really articulate or maybe define that what kind of reformation strategy needs to be done. But moving to the issue now of like the comment I posted earlier on about us acting or enacting our action or inaction in the face of the closure of the democratic space. I believe at the end of the day, we have, activists in Zimbabwe have rather turned into political analysts, and the politicians have rather also tend to be, more calculative rather than more initiative. And, civil society also tend into maybe observers. And the church, I don't know what I would rather say, but it seems like everyone is kind of not fulfilling their obligation, whatever, to the national democratic revolution. And also everyone is individuals that they expect to fulfill that duty, the duty that they themselves have engaged in, kind of habitual dereliction of fulfilling. They've habitually derelicted their mandates, and also expect somebody else or some people to fulfill that, which brings everything to the crisis that we are in, which can also be argued whether to maybe also lack of democratic practices within the wider opposition movement, or also people not really rising up to demand their space, of which is an argument for another day, that for us to really say within the opposition, a democratic space is also being shut up. If we can't really also stand up to demand it, how can we also demand it from ZANU-PF? That's number one. Then number two, I also really believe that I think maybe just 4 minutes I'll be done. I just
4 minutes. Unfortunately, we're going to have to bring it to a close. We already are in extended time, and I can see Brian has had his hand for a long time as well. Marco, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to give Brian, at least he can have a minute, and then we can close the call. Please do go ahead and add in your points in the chat. Brian, are you still available to, do you still want to say something? I can't see you.
Are you talking, sorry, are you talking to me or Brian McGarry?
I'm talking to Brian McGarry.
Yeah, you need to be specific there.
Sorry, you are professor. you are Professor Raft, I've been told. No, I was referring to Brian McGarry. He had his hand up, but I don't seem to see.
No, he inboxed me what to say. I can say it.
Okay, yeah, please.
Yeah. Then I think in summation, at the end of the day, I think we need to have another discussion of this sort with a kind of a different topic, where we rather would be focusing on also solutions, because this topic for me, I think what it really needed to be was more of what we should do in the face of, a competitive authoritarian regime, because it's a hybrid regime which we have not faced like in the past 20 years, and these ones they've captured the justice system, they've captured the police, they've captured they've appointed their children, they have captured critical processes. Yes, they hold elections, pretend to be democratic, but they undermine the core, elements and tenets of democracy itself. So I think we need to really discuss that. And if we discuss that, it will also inform now when we come to criticize the critical players like the CCC and the wider opposition, and also ZANU-PF, we will now be criticizing them based on what, the set rules that we would have agreed as a people that needs to be said. But so far, what is lacking generally in Zimbabwe, there's not a shared vision on what we want. There's not a shared vision of where we should go. There's not a shared vision, even whether on reforms or lack of them. So I believe, I have a lot to say really, but it's myself. Yeah.
I'm going to have to draw it to a close because we are over the extension, and I can see we have a very vibrant chat going as well. Dr. Zamchia, I didn't see your hand up, but you have made a reference to reading your paper, the MDCTs, and seeing eye in Zimbabwe's 2013 harmonized elections, technical knockout. So I've just read that out for interested parties, and your other paper on competitive electoral authoritarianism, I can never say that word, in Zimbabwe. But I think it's fair to say that we have had a really, really good discussion. I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Mavedzenge, as well, for bringing in your submissions. I think we can all unanimously agree that this discussion, it certainly means we need to have a go at it again, especially in light of the points that have been raised by the participants. And just to remind everyone as well that we will be having another session in this series next week on the 27th. So do join us again. So I guess what then can we conclude on the challenges of opposition politics? I think we all agree that the challenges exist. There are vast constraints, that we have seen the impacts of these constraints in terms of the measurables. I myself, as an economist, I always like to go back to what I can count, and the measurables in terms of the registration numbers, the youth vote, that we are so relying on the youth bulge that Dr. Mandaza was highlighting to us, that we're not seeing the numbers. Is it a matter of an unready opposition, as was highlighted by Dr. Mavedzenge, or is it a wider question on the whole space of citizen engagement as well as civic society participation, as was highlighted, that is having an impact on this? Is it fair? Are we comparing apples with apples, Dr. Mavedzenge? I'm not sure when we talk about the bargaining power of Morgan Tsvangirai during the GNU, and again as Prime Minister, vis-a-vis the position that we are in now. Perhaps, as Dr. Dendere pointed out, that maybe the response in this season is slightly different. It is a response of international diplomatic engagement. It's a response maybe that you might not see on the streets, but is it going to achieve for us a greater mileage as we move towards democratization? I don't know. But here we are. This is the situation, and hopefully Dr. Mandaza will afford us another opportunity to have a similar discussion in the not so distant future. With that, I'd like to say good night to everybody. Thank you for joining us for what I think has been a very informative discussion. Thank you.
Tango e komaka vote